Right now, on every coast and headland in the world, a light is turning. It has been turning for a very long time. Tonight follows that light all the way back to where it began, more than 2,000 years ago, on a small island in an Egyptian harbor, and all the way forward to where it burns tonight. Before we continue, just wanted to let you know that we have heard your feedback and we're now on Spotify. Go through the link in the description to join us there for a rich listening experience. There are approximately 18,600 lighthouses in active operation around the world at this moment. Most of them are automated now. No human keeper, no logbook being filled in, no lamp wick to trim before sunrise. They run on timers and backup batteries, and occasional visits from a maintenance crew who arrives by boat and leaves again before nightfall. But the light itself continues, turning at its prescribed interval, sending its particular coded pattern out across the water at the same moment on every night of the year, as reliable as anything humans have built. That reliability is most of what a lighthouse is. A light that you can count on is a light you can navigate by, and what sailors have always needed. On a dark coastline with rocks below the surface and fog reducing visibility to a ship's length in any direction, is something exactly that. A source of light they can find without knowing precisely where they are. Something fixed in space and predictable in time, that says with every revolution, simply and clearly, here is where you are, and here is what is dangerous, and here is where the water is safe. The word lighthouse itself carries the history of this need inside it. Most lighthouse words in European languages are descendants of a single Greek word, Pharos, which was the name of a small limestone island that sat at the entrance to the harbor of Alexandria in Egypt. That island, and the city it guarded, and the tower built on its eastern tip around 280 BCE, gave the French their word phare, the Spanish and Italians their word faro, the Portuguese their farol, and the Greek language itself its modern word for lighthouse, still pronounced today almost exactly as it was in the time of the Ptolemaic dynasty. A word, passed down through 2 full thousand years and still in daily use, is its own kind of lighthouse. It marks something that was, that remained necessary, and that therefore quietly continued. Tonight is the story behind that word. It begins with a furnace burning on a small Egyptian island and moves slowly through the history of every structure built after it. The Roman lighthouses along coasts long since renamed, the impossible offshore towers built on rocks that the sea covered twice a day, the remarkable lenses that transformed a modest oil lamp into a beam visible 20 miles from shore, the men and women who tended these lights for their entire working lives, and sometimes for all of the lives they had after that, the foghorns and the logbooks and the migratory birds whose entire navigational science was gradually mapped by lighthouse keepers recording what they saw. It ends where it began, with a light turning over dark water tonight, quiet and steady and still keeping its ancient purpose, and with the particular kind of rest that comes from knowing that some things, once properly made, do not need to stop. If tonight finds you settling in for a long, gentle rest, this is a good place to let it happen. There are 19 chapters ahead, none of them in a hurry, each one moving a little further into the quiet that belongs to the edge of the sea at night. We will follow the light all the way to where it reaches, and then we will let it go on without us, as it has always done. The lighthouse beam does not require an audience. It sweeps the horizon once every few seconds, and does not pause to see whether anyone is watching. It turns because turning is what it was built to do, and because somewhere out on the water, always, there is someone for whom that light is the difference between finding the harbor and not finding it at all. That constancy, patient and undemanding, and lit against the same darkness every night without exception, is what this story is made of. It began a very long time ago, with a fire held up into the sky over an ancient city, and it continues tonight with whatever light is closest to wherever you are right now. Turn the light on, find the harbor, go home. That is the full instruction, and it has never changed, and it has been sufficient for 2,000 years of coastlines and ships and people trying to find their way. The island of Pharos is where we start. The island of Pharos was small, low, and dangerous. It sat at the entrance to the harbour of Alexandria, the city founded by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE, on the narrow strip of Egypt's northern coast between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Mareotis. The waters around the island were shallow and treacherous, the surrounding coastline flat and featureless, offering ships no natural landmark to navigate by. A harbour with nothing to find it by in the dark is a harbour that kills people approaching it at night, and Alexandria was the most important trading port in the eastern Mediterranean. Something had to mark it. Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander's generals who had stayed behind to rule Egypt after the great conqueror's death, commissioned the lighthouse. His son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, completed it around 280 BCE, and the architect responsible for the design was a man named Sostratus of Cnidus. The tower was built in 3 distinct stages, each one set back from the one below it: a broad square base, an octagonal midsection, and a cylindrical top. A broad spiral ramp ran up through the interior, wide enough for horses and carts to carry fuel to the top, and at the apex, a furnace burned through every night, its fire amplified and directed toward the sea by a polished bronze mirror. The tower stood over 100 meters tall, somewhere between 110 and 135 meters, depending on which ancient source you consult. When it was completed, only the 2 Great Pyramids of Giza were taller. For centuries after, it was one of the tallest structures of any kind that human beings had ever built. Ancient accounts claim the light could be seen from as far as 35 miles out to sea, which would have made it visible to a ship long before that ship reached any real danger. It was, in the most straightforward sense, exactly what it needed to be: a fire held high enough and bright enough to be found. The tower that Sostratus built stood for roughly 1,600 years, which is longer than the entire history of the country where most people reading this were born. 3 earthquakes damaged it progressively, the most destructive in 1303 CE, which historians estimate at a magnitude of 8 or above, and another in 1323 CE that reduced whatever remained of the upper structure to rubble. By 1480, the Sultan of Egypt, Kate Bey, needed stone for a defensive fort he was building on the same site, and the remaining blocks of the Pharos were incorporated into its walls. If you visit the citadel of Kate Bey today, you can see blocks visibly out of proportion to the surrounding masonry, enormous limestone and granite sections that once formed part of the ancient world's most famous lighthouse. In 1994, a French archaeologist named Jean-Yves Empereur led an underwater excavation in Alexandria's eastern harbour and discovered the ruins on the sea floor. Statues, architectural elements, and large stone blocks that had toppled into the water over the centuries of the structure's long decay. Since then, intermittent dives have found more. In early 2025, researchers raised 22 colossal stone blocks from the harbour, some weighing as much as 80 tons, including sections of the lighthouse's threshold and door lintels. A digital reconstruction of the entire structure is ongoing, building a picture of the original from what the seafloor has preserved. What the Pharos left behind is more than stones. The name of the island passed into Greek as the standard word for any lighthouse structure, and from there into more languages than almost any other piece of specialized vocabulary in the world. French speakers call a lighthouse a phare. Italian speakers call it a faro. Spanish and Portuguese speakers use the same root words, faro and farol. Romanian uses phare. The island of Pharos gave the world not just the first great lighthouse, but the word for all the lighthouses that came after it. The dedication inscription on the original tower, reported by ancient writers and attributed to Sostratus himself, reportedly read, "Sostratus of Cnidus, the son of Dexiphanes, to the gods of safety, on behalf of those who sail the seas. This is either the most concise possible summary of what a lighthouse is for, or it is the earliest piece of maritime safety signage in recorded history, depending on whether you are in a mood for philosophy or practicality. The two possibilities are not actually that different. A fire held up over a dangerous harbor, in service of the people trying to reach it safely. Whatever it was built from and whatever it was called, that is what every lighthouse built since has been. The Pharos was not, however, the first attempt to place a navigational light somewhere sailors could find it. The history of fires at harbor mouths is older than Alexandria itself, and it left behind at least one structure still standing and still doing its original job. Fires at harbor mouths are as old as harbors. Before the Pharos of Alexandria, before any purpose-built lighthouse structure, sailors in every seafaring culture had lit fires on hilltops, burned torches at harbor entrances, and kept flames going on elevated ground at the approaches to ports and anchorages they wanted arriving ships to find in the dark. This was not architecture. It was a practical arrangement between the people inside a harbor and the people trying to reach them. We are here. This is where the safe water begins. Do not hit the rocks to the left of this light. The Pharos transformed that practical arrangement into something permanent, engineered, and architecturally serious. But it was not the beginning of the human impulse to put fire where sailors could see it. It was the point at which that impulse became a building. After Alexandria built its lighthouse, Rome built them across its empire, at the entrances to ports and harbors from Britain to North Africa to the eastern Mediterranean. Most of these Roman structures no longer exist above ground. Their foundations have been excavated, their stones repurposed by later builders who needed material more than they needed the monuments, and their outlines are known now primarily through archaeology rather than survival. But one Roman lighthouse is still standing, still operational, and still guiding ships into the harbor it was built to serve. The Tower of Hercules stands on a headland near the city of A Coruña on the northwestern corner of Spain, where the Atlantic coast of the Iberian Peninsula meets the Bay of Biscay. It was built in the 2nd century CE, during the Roman period, on a design clearly influenced by the Pharos of Alexandria, which it closely resembles in its overall form: a broad stone base, a tapering tower, a three-tiered arrangement moving from wide to narrow. Its original Roman fabric still exists within the current outer structure, which was rebuilt and raised in 1790. The lighthouse is still lit, still active as a navigational aid, and in 2009, it was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized as the world's oldest lighthouse in continuous operation. The Tower of Hercules is approximately 55 meters tall. Ships approaching A Coruña from the Atlantic have been using it as a navigational reference for nearly 2,000 years. Through the entire lifespan of everything built in the interim, through the rise and fall of multiple civilizations, through every change in the design of the ships themselves, from Roman trading vessels to medieval galleons to modern container ships equipped with GPS. The tower on the headland was there before all of it, and it remains. Other Roman lighthouses were built along the coast of the English Channel and the North Sea, including the Colossus of Boulogne on the northern coast of what is now France, a tall tower described by ancient writers as standing over 60 meters and providing a reference point for ships crossing between Britain and the continent. This tower survived for centuries into the medieval period and was a landmark for Viking traders and Norman crossings before finally collapsing in 1644. Its base remained visible in Boulogne for years afterward. In the centuries between the fall of the Roman Empire and the organized lighthouse programs of the 17th and 18th centuries, the maintenance of coastal lights passed through various informal arrangements. Religious institutions in coastal communities sometimes took on responsibility for maintaining lights at harbor entrances, with monks or other clergy tending a beacon as part of their broader obligations to travelers and mariners. The Corporation of Trinity House, the authority that still oversees aids to navigation around England, Wales, and much of the surrounding coastline, received its original royal charter from King Henry V in 1514 and has been responsible for lighthouse maintenance in those waters ever since. What this long stretch of history tells us is that the lighthouse is not a recent innovation solving a problem that sailors had previously lived without solving. It is one of the oldest continuous engineering projects in human civilization, handed from one set of builders and tenders to the next, across a span of time that encompasses the entire history of writing, recorded religion, and organized governance. Every lighthouse, built in the last 300 years, is the continuation of a tradition that began before most of the religions currently practiced by most of the people alive today had yet been founded. All of these structures, from the Pharos to the Tower of Hercules to the most recent automated LED beacon installed on a remote headland last year, share one fundamental characteristic: a light source elevated high enough to extend its range over the curve of the Earth. The physics underlying that elevation is what determines everything else about the design. The reason a lighthouse needs to be tall is the same reason you can stand at the ocean's edge and watch a ship disappear over the horizon, even on a completely clear day. The Earth is a sphere. Its surface curves. No matter how powerful your light source, no matter how clear the air, a beam emitted from ground level will eventually dip below the line of sight between the lighthouse and the ship it is trying to reach, hidden behind the planet's own curvature. The only way to extend the range of the light is to raise it higher. The relationship between height and range follows a reasonably simple mathematical pattern. The theoretical visible distance of a lighthouse in nautical miles is approximately equal to 1.17 times the square root of its height above sea level in feet. A lighthouse with its focal plane, the elevation of the lamp itself, at 100 feet above sea level, has a theoretical range of approximately 11.7 nautical miles. Raise the focal plane to 200 feet, and the range extends to about 16.5 nautical miles. The gain from each additional foot of height is real, but diminishing, which is why lighthouse designers have always had to balance the practical engineering costs of building taller against the actual navigational benefit of a few more miles of range. The early lighthouse lamp, before any significant optical improvement, was a fire. A fire placed on a hilltop, or at the top of a stone tower, or burning in a lantern room fitted with glass to protect it from the wind, does what any uncontrolled light source does. It radiates in every direction simultaneously. Some of that light goes straight up into the sky, completely useless for navigation. Some goes straight down into the tower. Some lights the surrounding land or sea at short range in ways that don't help a ship 20 miles out. Only the fraction of the total light output that happens to radiate toward the horizon in the right direction is doing any navigational work at all. Before the 18th century, this waste was simply accepted as the nature of fire. You burned enough fuel to produce a flame large enough that even the small fraction directed toward the sea was visible from a useful distance, and you made sure the tower was tall enough that the light could clear the local geography and reach out over the water. The fuel costs were significant, the efficiency was low, and the range was limited by what the flame itself could produce, rather than by what was theoretically possible with better optics. The 18th century brought the first serious attempts to improve this situation through the use of reflectors, curved metal mirrors placed behind the light source to direct more of the emitted light toward the sea. Parabolic reflectors of silvered metal could capture and redirect a meaningful fraction of the light that would otherwise scatter upward or sideways, concentrating it into a useful beam. This was a genuine improvement. The best reflector systems of the early 19th century were considerably more effective than open flames, and they enabled lighthouse designers to work with less fuel for a given range, or extend the range for a given fuel supply. But even the best parabolic reflectors of the era captured only about half of the available light. The other half was still lost, and the reflectors themselves were imperfect, requiring constant polishing and maintenance to remain effective. Tarnished metal is a much poorer reflector than polished metal, and the maintenance burden on lighthouse keepers, who were already responsible for fuel management, wick trimming, and general upkeep, was considerable. The lighthouse keepers, who trimmed the wicks and tended the oil, were called wickies, a colloquial term that stuck to the profession for as long as oil lamps remained in use. Trimming the wick of an oil lamp is not a complicated task, but it is an essential one. A wick that has burned too long without attention develops a charred, irregular end that produces more smoke than light, darkening the glass of the lantern room and reducing visibility at exactly the moment when the light needs to be at its clearest. A keeper whose wick was properly trimmed was a keeper whose light was doing its job. A keeper whose wick was neglected was a keeper who was causing shipwrecks. The entire architecture of the profession, its discipline, its logbooks, its inspection system, its hierarchy of principal keepers and assistant keepers, was built around ensuring that the wick was trimmed and the oil was full, and the glass was clean, and the light was burning at its full potential every night without exception. The mission was simple. The reliability required to fulfill it was extraordinary. It would take a young French physicist, assigned to a lighthouse commission in 1819, partly as a career detour, to identify the specific optical problem these keepers were working around every night, and to design a solution so elegant that it is still visible in lighthouse lantern rooms around the world today. In 1819, Augustin Jean Fresnel was assigned, as what he probably considered a secondary duty alongside his primary work in theoretical physics, to the French Commission of Lighthouses, charged with finding a better way to illuminate French coastal lights. He was 31 years old, already deep into the work on wave optics that would eventually overturn a century of Newtonian particle theory and reshape the foundations of physics. The lighthouse assignment was a practical detour from that theoretical work, but Fresnel approached it with the same fundamental question he brought to everything: what is being wasted, and how can it be recovered? The answer, in the case of lighthouse illumination, was light. Enormous quantities of light were being wasted in every direction except the one that mattered. The parabolic reflectors then in use captured roughly half the available output from a lamp. The other half radiated into the sky, into the tower, into the sea, immediately below the lens room, in every direction except the horizontal plane, where ships were actually sailing. Fresnel's insight was not to improve the reflector, but to abandon it in favor of something completely different. Rather than placing a curved mirror behind the light, Fresnel designed a system of glass prisms arranged in concentric rings around the light source. These prisms bent and redirected the light in both the horizontal and vertical planes, folding it into a concentrated beam directed toward the horizon. The resulting structure, built from concentric rings of precisely shaped glass, stepping outward from a central bullseye panel, looked something like a beehive when assembled, and it used only a fraction of the glass that a conventional large lens would have required, because it relied on refraction through the angled edges of relatively thin panels, rather than transmission through a massive solid lens. The concept drew on optical ideas that had circulated for decades, but the specific engineering achievement of making it work reliably at lighthouse scale was Fresnel's. He worked closely with the Parisian optician François Soleil Senior to manufacture the glass elements, refining the design through 1820 and 1821, and eventually moving from polygonal glass segments to fully curved elements as the manufacturing process improved. On the evening of April 13th, 1821, the completed lens was demonstrated at opposite ends of Paris, with observers stationed at the Paris Observatory and on the distant hills of Montmartre, watching from over 5 miles away. The Commission of Lighthouses attended, Sailors and members of the public attended. The single-lens panel, compared directly to the most advanced reflector system then available, rendered it immediately and obviously obsolete. Fresnel later described the commission members as dazzled by the spectacle. The first working lighthouse Fresnel lens was assembled at Cordouan Lighthouse, on a rocky outcrop at the mouth of the Gironde estuary on France's Atlantic coast. It was lit for the first time on July 25, 1823, and as expected, the light was visible to the horizon, more than 32 kilometers away, a range that the previous reflector system could not approach. Fresnel himself had partially assembled the lens with his own hands. The design was scaled into a series of sizes called orders, running from first order through sixth. A first-order Fresnel lens, the largest and most powerful, stood roughly 2.5 meters tall, weighed several tons, and was designed for use in major coastal lighthouses, where maximum range was essential, typically producing a beam visible more than 20 miles in clear conditions. A sixth-order lens was small enough to fit in a harbor lantern and was intended only for short-range local use. Between them, the intermediate orders provided lighthouse designers with options calibrated to almost any navigational requirement. By the 1860s, all active lighthouses in the United States had been fitted with Fresnel lenses. Britain, France, and the other major maritime nations had adopted them across their coastal systems with similar speed. The lens was a genuine revolution in maritime safety, extending the effective range of lighthouses already in existence without requiring taller towers, and enabling new lighthouses to do more with less fuel than had ever been possible before. Augustin Fresnel died on July 14, 1827, of tuberculosis, aged 39. He had been ill for most of the years he spent developing both the wave theory of light and the lens that bears his name, working through his illness at a pace his doctors repeatedly warned him was shortening his life. The commission that he had partly treated as a detour became, in retrospect, one of his most consequential contributions, the thing that made the century of lighthouse building that followed him possible. He did not live to see a single lighthouse he had improved. His name remains on the lens, on the principle of his optics, and on the dozens of historic Fresnel lenses still on display in maritime museums around the world. Their hundreds of precisely ground glass prisms, still catching whatever light falls on them and bending it with the same quiet efficiency they demonstrated for the first time in a public spectacle on a Paris evening in 1821. Many of these lenses are illuminated in their museum cases so visitors can see them working, and the experience of standing beside a fully lit first-order Fresnel lens, something roughly the size of a small car, its concentric rings of glass turning slowly in the light, is described by almost everyone who sees one as unexpectedly beautiful. The engineering is visible. The elegance of the solution is immediately apparent to anyone looking at it. The problem it was designed to solve and the specific, precise way the solution addresses that problem are both legible without any explanation at all. The problem with most lighthouses is that they need to be placed precisely where it is hardest to build anything at all. Safe, accessible harbors do not need lighthouses. The danger is always at the edges, on the rocky headlands, the shifting sandbars, the submerged reefs that lurk a few feet below the surface at high tide and lie exposed and dripping at low tide, waiting for hulls. These are the places where ships have run aground and broken apart for as long as ships have existed, and these are therefore the places where lighthouses are most urgently needed. They are also, in almost every case, the places most exposed to the open sea, most difficult to reach, and most difficult to build on. The Eddystone Rocks, 14 miles southwest of Plymouth on England's southern coast, are a prime example. They sit in the direct approach path for ships entering the Plymouth Sound from the English Channel, a stretch of water used continuously by naval and merchant traffic. For centuries, they were simply a killing ground. an unmarked hazard that caught ships at night and in fog and in storms throughout the year. The first serious attempt to place a lighthouse on them was made by Henry Winstanley, an English engineer with considerable confidence in his own design. Winstanley built a wooden lighthouse on the Eddystone Rocks in 1698, was not satisfied with it, rebuilt and enlarged it in 1699 to something more elaborate, and then, on the night of November 26, 1703, was present inside his structure when the great storm struck the English coast. The storm was one of the most violent ever recorded in British waters, killing thousands of people across England. Winstanley, his lighthouse, and everyone inside it were swept away entirely. No trace of the structure was found after the storm. 3 more lighthouses have been built on the Eddystone Rocks since Winstanley's. The current 4th structure was completed in 1882 and still stands. The Bell Rock, 12 miles off the east coast of Scotland near Arbroath, presented a different and in some ways more difficult problem. The rock is covered by the sea for approximately 22 hours out of every 24, exposed above the surface only during the lowest tides and only briefly. Ships had been wrecking on it for centuries. Robert Stevenson, Scotland's Inspector of Lights, and the grandfather of the novelist Robert Louis Stevenson, began construction of a lighthouse on the Bell Rock in 1807. Workers could only reach the rock for a few hours each day, during the narrow window when the tides had receded enough to expose a working surface. They were ferried out by boat, worked until the rising tide forced them back, and were ferried to shore or to an accompanying floating barrack vessel to wait for the next low tide. Stevenson later observed that his engineers had internalized the tide schedule so completely that they would wake from sleep before the alarm, already preparing themselves for the next working period, their bodies adjusted to the rhythm of the sea's timetable rather than any ordinary clock. The Bell Rock Lighthouse was completed and first lit in 1811. The tower tapers from a base roughly 12 meters in diameter to a much narrower upper section and lantern room, and it has stood continuously in the open North Sea for over 200 years since its completion. It is the oldest sea-washed lighthouse in the world still in active operation. It required no significant structural repairs for the first 150 years of its life, a testament to the engineering that Stevenson and his workers achieved under conditions that allowed only a few hours of work at a time. The Cape Hatteras Lighthouse in North Carolina, at 198 feet the tallest brick lighthouse in the United States, presented a different kind of challenge, the sea coming to it rather than surrounding it. When it was completed in 1870, it stood more than 1,500 feet from the shoreline. By the late 20th century, coastal erosion had brought the waterline to within roughly 120 feet of the lighthouse's base. Between 1999 and 2000, the entire lighthouse, 4,800 tons of brick and granite, was moved inland on a system of steel beams and rolling dollies, traveling 2,900 feet over 23 days to its new position. It was one of the largest historic structure relocations ever attempted, and it worked. The lighthouse still stands at Hatteras, in its new location, still lit. The people who built these structures were solving problems that no previous generation had solved, in conditions that were frequently hostile, with materials that had to be carried to the site by boat or derrick, in weather that could strand workers for days or destroy months of work overnight. They did it because a dark rock in a shipping lane is always going to be someone's last night, unless there is a light on it. The people who lived in lighthouses were called wickies, a nickname that came from their most fundamental and non-negotiable daily task, trimming the wick of the oil lamp. It was not a glamorous job. A wick that had been burning through the night developed a charred, irregular tip that produced more smoke than light, clouding the lens and reducing the beam's range at precisely the moment when another night was beginning and the beam needed to be at its best. The first duty every day, before anything else, was to bring the wick back to a clean, even edge, and ensure the oil reservoir was full and the glass of the lantern room was clear of condensation and smoke residue. The daily schedule of a lighthouse keeper was organized entirely around the light. At nightfall, the lamp was lit. Through the night, keepers stood watch in rotating shifts, ensuring the lamp remained burning. The lens kept rotating, and the clockwork mechanism that drove the rotation was wound at its required intervals. At dawn, the lamp was extinguished and the lens was cleaned. Then the daylight hours were spent on maintenance, polishing the brass fittings, checking the oil supply, inspecting the fog signal equipment, maintaining the logbook, cleaning the keeper's quarters, tending to the grounds of shore stations, making minor repairs to whatever the previous night or week had worn or broken. Rock lighthouse stations placed these requirements in an unusually concentrated form. At Bell Rock, off the Scottish coast, the three-keeper rotation shared a circular living space roughly 13 feet in diameter, with 3 bunks set into the curved wall, one above the other, each one provided with a curtain as the only privacy available. The kitchen and living area were in the same small room as the sleeping area, divided by nothing except convention. The lighthouse did not have a toilet of any kind until 1964, when a saltwater unit was installed. Before that, arrangements for basic sanitation at a rock station required a kind of practical resilience that most people who have never lived at sea find difficult to fully imagine. Water was rationed carefully. At rock stations supplied by tender vessels that visited only occasionally, keepers monitored their water supply the way a ship's crew monitors fuel, constant awareness of what remained, careful management of what was used. The daily measurement of essential stores, oil, paraffin, and water alike, was a required entry in the logbook, part of the documentation of whether the station was functioning within its normal parameters. On-shore stations, where the lighthouse stood on a coastline accessible by road or regular boat, the keeper's world was considerably more comfortable and considerably more social. The United States Lighthouse Board, which administered American lighthouses for much of the 19th century, expressed a strong preference for married keepers, whom they considered more reliable and more likely to maintain a station to the required standard than single men living alone. Most shore lighthouse stations were therefore inhabited not only by the keeper, but by the keeper's family, with children growing up in the lighthouse or in the attached keeper's house, learning the rhythms of the light as a fundamental feature of their childhood. The children raised at lighthouse stations carried strict and clearly remembered rules about the lantern room. The lens was not to be touched. This was enforced with a firmness that one keeper's son, writing in his memoirs decades later, described as the closest thing to a religious prohibition he encountered in his childhood. They wouldn't let me touch it. Oh my God, that would be sacrilegious, to go up there and touch the lights. No, I might put fingerprints on the lens or something. The lens was the reason for everything. Its cleanliness was the keeper's primary obligation. The children knew this before they knew almost anything else. Because lighthouse stations were often remote, the keeper's role frequently passed from parent to child, not by formal requirement, but by the simple logic of someone being trained in the work and available to continue it. Families served at the same lighthouse for multiple generations, coming to know a particular stretch of coastline, a specific set of hazards, and the specific pattern of weather and sea conditions at their station with an intimacy that no infrequent visitor could match. This accumulated local knowledge was itself a form of maritime safety. A keeper who had watched 30 winter storms from the same promontory knew things about the sea in that place that no chart could fully represent. The light, the lens, the logbook, the wick, day after day, year after year, at every station. The repetition was the whole point. The light that never missed a night was the light sailors could count on. The keeper whose routine never wavered was the keeper who was doing the job correctly. What that routine cost, in terms of the human toll of isolation and the particular weight of years spent at the edge of the sea, is a story that belongs to the next chapter. Isolation was the central fact of lighthouse life at most stations. And the ways keepers managed it, or failed to, reveal something about the range of what human beings can find in a life stripped down to a few essential duties and a great deal of quiet. The challenge was not simply loneliness in the ordinary sense. It was the combination of physical remoteness and the unremitting responsibility of the work itself. A keeper could not choose to take a day away from the wick and the logbook and the fog signal without the light going dark, which meant that unlike almost any other form of isolation, lighthouse solitude carried with it a continuous, non-negotiable obligation that prevented even the limited relief of simply doing nothing for a while. The isolation and the duty were inseparable, and together they produced a psychological environment unlike almost any other available to ordinary working people of the era. Many keepers found practical solutions in craft and hobby. Woodworking was common at shore stations, where materials could be obtained. Some keepers painted, producing work of occasional real quality that has survived in maritime collections. Reading was nearly universal. Some kept small gardens, in whatever soil was available near shore stations, tending to something growing in an environment where the sea dominated everything. A few keepers at rock stations improvised container gardens in the lantern room's limited windowsill space, growing herbs in whatever light reached the south-facing glass. The Nantucket lightship basket is a direct and commercially enduring product of lighthouse isolation. Lightships, which will be covered in a later chapter, were floating lighthouses anchored at sea to mark hazards too far from shore for a conventional structure. Their crews served in shifts of 20 to 21 days at anchor, unable to see land, the ship rolling continuously, even in moderate weather. To pass the time, crews of Nantucket lightships developed the craft of weaving rattan baskets over wooden molds, producing a distinctive form that became so thoroughly associated with their vessels that the baskets carry the name today. Nantucket lightship baskets now sell for hundreds of dollars in the shops along the Nantucket waterfront, their origins in the desperate boredom of men on a ship going nowhere, largely forgotten by the buyers who carry them. For others, the isolation was genuinely damaging. Documented cases of psychological strain, depression, and in extreme instances, more serious breakdown, appear in the historical record of lighthouse keeping, particularly at the most remote rock stations and the most isolated shore lights on uninhabited coastlines. The combination of physical confinement, limited human contact, and the relentless sound of wind and sea in a storm produced conditions that some keepers adapted to and others did not. Seguin Island lies about 2 miles off the coast of Maine, at the mouth of the Kennebec River. Its lighthouse is the highest on the Maine coast, placed on a granite summit 180 feet above sea level, and it is reached by boat from the mainland. The island is small, exposed, and has been continuously inhabited during its lighthouse operation since 1795. The station is said to be haunted by the ghost of a lighthouse keeper's wife from the mid-19th century, a woman whose husband, in an attempt to relieve her boredom and isolation during a prolonged winter posting, obtained a piano for the house. She played it constantly. She played the same piece, over and over, until, according to the story that has passed from keeper to keeper for nearly 2 centuries, the keeper himself could bear it no longer and destroyed the instrument. Visitors to Seguin Island today still report hearing piano music late at night, a single melody playing in empty rooms. The story is almost certainly a story, but the conditions it describes, the desperate attempt to provide stimulation in an environment with none, the accumulated strain of close quarters and endless repetition, the tipping point when something perfectly reasonable becomes intolerable, are as accurate a portrait of the worst of lighthouse isolation as any formal historical account. The keepers who thrived were often people who had found, somewhere in their character, a genuine capacity for the kind of attention that a very quiet, very repetitive life demands. The ability to notice small things, to find meaning in routine, to be interested in the sea and the weather and the wildlife, without requiring anything spectacular from any of them. These were the keepers who filled their logbooks with careful observations about passing ships and unusual birds, and the precise character of each night's weather, who tended their gardens and kept their lenses immaculate, and served their full careers without incident. They were, in their own quiet way, unusually good at being human in a very small space. The keepers who are most remembered, however, tended to be the ones whose particular moment of solitude was interrupted by something that required them to act immediately, decisively, and at genuine personal risk. Women served as lighthouse keepers throughout the history of the profession, and they were not an exception or a curiosity. They were a consistent presence in the historical record, at lighthouses across the United States, Britain, Ireland, and beyond, from the earliest years of organized coastal lighting through the full span of the keeper era. Many took on the role after a husband died, stepping into the work out of practical necessity and then continuing long beyond what any external expectation would have required. Some served for decades, outlasting every other keeper who had held the same position before them. No one who held the role longer or became more widely known for it than the keeper of Lime Rock Lighthouse in Newport, Rhode Island. Ida Lewis was born in 1842, the daughter of a lighthouse keeper, and grew up at Lime Rock, a small station on an island so close to Newport's harbor that it could be reached by rowing a short distance from shore. When her father suffered a stroke in 1857 that left him incapacitated, Ida, then 15 years old, took over the practical operation of the lighthouse, rowing her younger siblings to school each morning and performing the maintenance and watch duties that the station required. She continued this for years before receiving any official recognition, tending the light on a station that her father nominally held. In 1869, Ida Lewis became famous. The national press discovered her, and Harper's Weekly placed her on its cover on July 31 of that year, with an article that described her rescue career. She had by that point saved the lives of at least a dozen people from the waters around Lime Rock, pulling them from overturned boats and from the water in conditions that were frequently too cold and rough for most people to consider entering voluntarily. She was photographed, celebrated, visited by notable figures, including President Ulysses Grant, and received letters of admiration from across the country. She continued working. She received official appointment as the keeper of Lime Rock in 1879, finally holding the title she had effectively filled for 22 years. She served at the lighthouse until her death in 1911, 54 years after she had begun. She is credited with saving 18 lives in total. The Coast Guard cutter named after her, USGC Ida Lewis, was commissioned in 1997. In 1838, across the Atlantic, a keeper's daughter performed a rescue that made her one of the most celebrated people in Britain almost overnight. Grace Darling was 22 years old and lived at Longstone Lighthouse on the Farne Islands, a low-lying archipelago off the Northumberland coast of England, where her father William was the keeper. On the night of September 6, 1838, the paddle steamer SS Forfarshire, bound from Hull to Dundee with 60 passengers and crew, struck the Big Harcar Rocks in darkness and storm. The ship broke apart. Most of those aboard were lost immediately. A group of survivors clung to a section of the wreck visible from the lighthouse. At approximately 4 a.m. on the morning of September 7th, Grace and her father saw the survivors through the lighthouse telescope. The sea conditions made a rescue difficult, and the distance, roughly a mile through open water, made it genuinely dangerous for an open boat. They went anyway, the two of them rowing a flat-bottomed cobble through the breaking swell, reaching the survivors, loading 5 of them into the boat, and returning to the lighthouse. Grace's father then made a second trip with 2 of the rescued sailors to collect the remaining 4 survivors. 9 people were brought to Longstone alive. Grace Darling became, in the weeks and months following the rescue, one of the most famous people in Britain. She received hundreds of letters, gifts, and requests for meetings from strangers who had read about the rescue in the newspapers. Multiple artists painted her portrait, including some of the leading painters of the period. Queen Victoria sent personal congratulations. Her name became synonymous with a particular kind of quiet heroism, the heroism of someone who sees what needs to be done and does it without any particular claim to having been extraordinary. She died of tuberculosis on October 20th, 1842, 4 years after the rescue, at the age of 26. She had never fully adjusted to her fame and had spent her final years trying to return to the ordinary life of a lighthouse keeper's daughter, while the country refused to let her be anything less than a symbol. The Grace Darling Museum in Bamber, close to the Farne Islands, preserves the original coble in which she and her father made the rescue. Both Ida Lewis and Grace Darling kept the light. Both of them also, when the situation demanded more than keeping the light, simply did what was required. This was not exceptional for lighthouse keepers. It was, in fact, entirely consistent with the kind of person the role had always tended to select for, and the kind of attention to what was happening in the surrounding water that the role had always required. The logbooks the keepers kept, their daily record of exactly that kind of attention, turned out to contain something no one had anticipated or planned for. Every lighthouse keeper was required to keep a logbook, and the requirements were precise. Entries were to be made daily, covering weather conditions, barometric pressure, visibility, the hours during which the light burned, any visitors to the station, observations of maritime traffic, equipment status, and anything else relevant to the operation of the station. Supervisory inspectors reviewed the logbooks when they visited stations for their periodic checks, looking for gaps, inconsistencies, or evidence of inattention. A keeper whose logbook was incomplete or sloppily maintained was a keeper whose competence was in question. The keepers filled these books faithfully, day after day, year after year, at hundreds of stations across coastlines that were, for much of the 19th century, the most remote and least visited stretches of land in their respective countries. They recorded what they saw with the systematic, conscientious attention of people who understood that their observations were part of a record meant to endure. They had no particular reason to believe that anyone beyond their immediate supervisors would ever read what they wrote. This created, entirely without planning or intention, one of the most valuable scientific archives the 19th century produced. The weather data alone is extraordinary. Lighthouse stations were positioned on exposed headlands and offshore rocks that had no other regular human presence, and the meteorological records kept by keepers at these stations represent some of the only systematic weather observations available for many remote coastal locations before the age of modern instrumentation. Climatologists studying long-term patterns in Atlantic storm frequency, seasonal wind directions, and the temperature changes over the past 2 centuries still consult lighthouse logbooks from stations in Ireland, Scotland, and the American Northeast, because no other comparable record exists from those specific locations during that period. But the logbooks contain something beyond weather data. They contain birds. Lighthouse beams were, for much of the 19th century, among the brightest artificial lights in any landscape. Migratory birds navigate partly by stars, partly by the magnetic field of the Earth, and partly by visual landmarks, and a lighthouse beam cutting through the night sky disrupted these navigation systems in ways that caused birds to behave abnormally. They were drawn toward the light, circling it in confused orbits, sometimes colliding with the glass of the lantern room, sometimes spiraling around the tower for hours before the night ended. Keepers at exposed coastal stations on key migratory routes witnessed this phenomenon on autumn and spring nights, when bird movement was at its most intense, and they recorded what they saw with the same matter-of-fact thoroughness they brought to everything else in the logbook. The species they noted, the numbers they counted, the specific dates of these observations, This information was not being collected for any scientific purpose. It was being recorded because it was something that had happened at the station, and the logbook was the record of what happened at the station. But over decades of consistent observation at multiple stations, these bird records accumulated into something invaluable: a systematic, dated, geographically distributed record of migratory bird behavior that no naturalist of the era could have replicated through any deliberate field study. In the 1880s and 1890s, two Scottish naturalists, John Murray and John Harvey Brown, began systematically collecting bird observation records from Scottish lighthouse keepers, writing to stations across the Scottish mainland and island coasts, and asking keepers to report their sightings. What they assembled from these responses was the first comprehensive mapping of migratory bird routes across Scotland, drawn entirely from observations made by people who were not ornithologists and had not intended to do ornithological work. The resulting data contributed to the scientific understanding of bird migration in ways that are still acknowledged in modern ornithology. The logbooks also contained ships. Keepers at busy coastal stations noted the passage of vessels they recognized, recording the name of each ship and the direction it was traveling. When a ship that normally passed on a regular schedule failed to appear on its expected day, the keeper noted the absence. When a ship failed to appear for 2 days, the keeper noted it again. When word eventually came that a vessel had been lost, keepers sometimes found that their logbooks contained the last confirmed record of the ship's passage, the final entry in the vessel's history before it entered whatever stretch of water had taken it. The Cape Lookout Lighthouse in North Carolina has a logbook with an entry from November 12 and 13, 1833, describing a meteor shower that the keeper on watch that night wrote about in terms of astonishment, noting that it appeared to him as though the stars themselves were falling from the sky. This was the Leonid meteor storm of 1833, one of the most intense meteor events ever recorded in North American history. The keeper was watching something remarkable, and he wrote it down, carefully and exactly, because that was what his job required. The logbooks are in archives now. Many are digitized. They can be read by anyone with an internet connection and a reason to look. The handwriting of keepers dead for 150 years is legible on screens in cities and countries they never visited. Their daily records of weather and birds and ships and meteor showers available to anyone who knows where to look. Each one is the life's work of a person who understood that what you observe carefully and record honestly will eventually be of use to someone, even if you cannot know, at the time of writing, who that will turn out to be. On nights when the light cannot be seen, a lighthouse becomes a sound. Fog is the lighthouse's oldest and most complete adversary. It absorbs and diffuses light rather than transmitting it, rendering even the most powerful Fresnel lens essentially useless beyond a few hundred yards. A ship in thick fog could pass within a quarter mile of a lighthouse and never see it. All the engineering and maintenance and human devotion that went into keeping the lamp burning and the lens clean was irrelevant the moment the fog came in, and on the coastal routes where lighthouses were most needed, fog came in often. The solution was a completely separate system built not around light at all, but around sound. Sound travels through fog. The same air that scatters and absorbs light transmits pressure waves, and a loud enough sound at the right frequency can carry for miles through fog that makes an inch of visibility impossible. The earliest fog signals were bells, either rung by hand or operated by clockwork mechanisms that struck at regular intervals. A keeper at a fog bell station on a coastline known for persistent fog might stand the fog bell watch for hours at a stretch, listening to the muffled sound of the sea and sounding the bell at each prescribed interval, alert for the sound of a vessel approaching too close. Fog bells were placed at stations around Britain and North America from the early 19th century onward, and some are still preserved at lighthouse sites today, their iron surfaces green with age. Steam-powered fog signals replaced bells at larger stations as the technology became available in the second half of the 19th century. These produced considerably greater volume than any bell and could be heard several miles from shore under reasonable conditions. They ran on boilers requiring their own fuel supply and their own maintenance, adding another set of machinery to the keeper's already full roster of responsibilities. During periods of prolonged fog, a steam fog signal might run continuously for 24 hours or longer, its sound filling the station and the surrounding water with the same repeating pattern of blasts, measured in a rhythm calibrated so precisely that sailors could count it and know exactly which station they were hearing. Each lighthouse station with a fog signal was assigned a distinctive pattern, specific in its timing and number of blasts, so that a ship in fog could identify its position by listening as well as by seeing. A pattern of one long blast every 30 seconds meant one specific station. A pattern of 2 blasts every 20 seconds meant another. These patterns were published in the same sailing directions that listed the light characteristics for visual navigation, creating a complete reference system for both foggy and clear conditions. Electric foghorns eventually replaced steam signals at most stations, and the large, distinctively shaped horn funnels became one of the most recognizable features of lighthouse architecture, pointing seaward from the station buildings in arrays designed to project sound as far and as directionally as possible. The low frequencies these horns produced, the bass notes that traveled farthest and penetrated fog most effectively, were felt as much as heard, a physical vibration in the chest and the stomach at close range that no amount of familiarity made entirely comfortable. Lighthouse stations with active fog signals were among the most demanding keeper postings. The signal could not be switched off until the fog lifted, which on the Atlantic and Pacific coasts of the British Isles and North America might not be for days at a time. Keepers and their families lived with the foghorn running continuously, sleeping with it when they slept, eating with it, working with it, its rhythm filling every room and penetrating every thought. Local communities near powerful fog signal stations on the mainland reported the sound at times carrying 15 or 20 miles inland, waking people who had no idea what it was, and inspiring complaints that the local lighthouse authority was sometimes powerless to address. The sound existed because it needed to exist, and it would continue until the fog that justified it went away. There is one lighthouse whose fog signal carries a particular weight in maritime history, not because of its technical specifications, but because of an event that has remained unexplained for more than a century. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse stands on the Outer Hebrides off the west coast of Scotland, completed in 1899. On December 15th, 1900, the tender vessel Hesperus arrived to find the lighthouse dark and unmanned. 3 keepers who had been stationed there, Thomas Marshall, Donald MacArthur, and James Ducat, had vanished. The lighthouse was in order, the lens was clean, the logbook showed routine entries through December 15. The keepers themselves were simply gone, leaving no indication of what had happened, and have never been found. The cause of their disappearance remains unknown. Lighthouses have always been associated with the edge of things, with the boundary between the world people inhabit and the part of the world that is neither land nor open sea. This is, perhaps, why the fog signal seems appropriate to them. The lighthouse announces itself most insistently precisely when it cannot be seen, trusting sound to carry its message through conditions where light fails. Whether you can see it or not, the station is there. Whether the night is clear or obscured, the function continues. The only variable is whether it reaches you as light or as sound, and both of them, in the end, are saying the same thing. Every lighthouse in the world speaks in its own particular code, and any sailor who knows how to read it can identify exactly where they are simply by watching a light in the dark and counting. The system is called the characteristic, and it is the combination of a lighthouse's flash pattern, its timing, and the colors it displays in different directions. These variables, together, create a unique identifier for every lighthouse on every coast, published in official documents called light lists, maintained by maritime authorities in every coastal nation, and updated annually as new lights are established, old ones are decommissioned, and characteristics are occasionally changed. A sailor approaching an unfamiliar coast at night sees a light flashing in the distance and needs to know which lighthouse it is. They count the flashes in one complete cycle and time the interval between them. One flash every 5 seconds identifies one specific lighthouse. 2 flashes every 10 seconds identifies another. 3 flashes every 15 seconds identifies a third. The pattern is reliable, published, and consistent. The lighthouse flashes exactly as described in the light list, at exactly the interval specified, regardless of the weather or the time of night. The system works because every element of it is fixed and agreed upon, and has been for over a century. Color adds another layer of information. A lighthouse that shows a white light in one sector, a red light in another, and a green light in a third is telling approaching ships which direction they are approaching from and what that direction means in terms of local hazards. A red sector typically marks water that contains a danger, a reef, a shoal, a line of rocks just below the surface. A vessel seeing red from a lighthouse knows to pay careful attention to the chart for that area and to be alert. A vessel seeing white from the same lighthouse is in the safe fairway and can proceed with normal caution. Green sometimes marks a channel entrance, indicating a specific route that is safe to follow. This language of light required machinery capable of executing the programmed pattern precisely and reliably through every night of the year. And the engineering solution that handled this requirement for most of the golden age of lighthouse operation was elegant in a way that visitors to working historic lighthouses often find surprising. The large Fresnel lenses used in major lighthouses were substantial structures, some of them weighing several tons. They needed to rotate smoothly and consistently, completing each revolution at a precise, constant speed to produce the prescribed flash pattern. The obvious difficulty is that a lens of this weight, rotating on any conventional bearing, would produce enough friction to require a motor or a substantial clockwork mechanism to keep it moving. That friction would also, over time, cause the bearing surfaces to wear and the rotation to become irregular. The solution, adopted at lighthouse stations across the world from the late 19th century onward, was to float the lens. The rotating mechanism sat in a circular bath of liquid mercury, and the lens assembly rested on a ring of floats sitting in that mercury, essentially swimming in a dense metallic fluid that provided support without friction. Mercury is nearly 14 times denser than water. An assembly floating in it experiences almost no resistance to rotation at all. A first-order Fresnel lens weighing several tons, mounted on a mercury float bearing, could be set in motion with a gentle push from a single finger. A small clockwork mechanism winding at intervals was more than sufficient to maintain the rotation indefinitely. The mercury was eventually replaced, at most stations, by modern roller bearings, after the health risks of mercury vapor became fully understood in the second half of the 20th century. The transition was necessary, but it removed something from the engineering that had a particular quality: a lens the size of a small vehicle, weighing as much as a car, turning in its bath of silver metal with the smooth, almost effortless rotation of something 10 times lighter. Keepers who worked at stations with mercury float bearings described the experience of watching the lens turn as one of the quietly remarkable things in their working lives, something that looked as though it should require enormous effort and required almost none. Some historic Fresnel lenses with their mercury float bearings have been preserved and placed in maritime museums, where they are occasionally illuminated and set in rotation so visitors can experience what the system looked like in operation. The lens is lit, the bearing is engaged, and something the size of a refrigerator and the weight of a compact car begins to move. smoothly and continuously, faster than seems possible given its size, sending its precisely timed beam around the room. Museum visitors who see this for the first time consistently report being taken aback by it. The combination of scale and effortlessness is genuinely unexpected, even when you already know intellectually what to expect. The light still speaks. It still has its characteristic. It still identifies itself to anyone willing to watch it carefully and count. The world's lighthouses are as varied as the coastlines that required them, and the range of what has been built, from ancient towers on Mediterranean islands to modern composite structures on Pacific atolls, represents 2,000 years of engineering adapted to an enormous variety of conditions, climates, and navigational needs. No two coasts are the same, and the lighthouses built to serve them reflect that variation in almost every aspect of their design, construction, and operation. The oldest lighthouse site in the United States is Boston Light, on Little Brewster Island in Boston Harbor, where a lighthouse was first established in 1716, 300 years ago. The current tower was completed in 1783, after the original was destroyed during the American Revolution. Boston Light has been staffed continuously since its establishment, and it is the only lighthouse in the United States that still maintains a human keeper alongside its automated systems, as a recognition of its historic significance. The Coast Guard has designated it the last staffed lighthouse in America, a distinction maintained deliberately rather than practically. Portland Headlight stands on the rocky headland at Cape Elizabeth in Maine, completed in 1791 under orders from President George Washington. It is among the most photographed lighthouses in the world. Its white tower and keeper's house set against the Atlantic in a configuration that has drawn painters and photographers for 2 centuries. The lighthouse still operates actively, and the surrounding area is a state park. A survey of visitors at the site regularly produces the same response when people are asked what they expected before seeing it: that they expected it to be impressive, and that it was more so than expected. The Skerryvore Lighthouse stands on a reef off the Hebrides in Scotland, about 12 miles southwest of the island of Tiree, in the open Atlantic, where the seas can run to considerable height in winter storms. It was completed in 1844, designed by Alan Stevenson, the uncle of Robert Louis Stevenson, on a site that presented construction challenges comparable to those Robert Stevenson had faced at Bell Rock 3 decades earlier. At 48 meters, Skerryvore is the tallest lighthouse in Scotland, and it has stood on its exposed reef for nearly 200 years, in conditions that have tested everything built anywhere on the North Atlantic. The Fastnet Rock Lighthouse sits on a small granite rock about 4 miles off the southwestern tip of Ireland, the most southerly point of the Irish mainland, and one of the most exposed locations on the Atlantic coast of Europe. The current lighthouse, completed in 1904, was built from Cornish granite, hauled to the site by ship, and assembled by workers who could only land on the rock when conditions permitted, which was not always. The tower stands 54 meters tall and has become internationally known as the turning mark for the Fastnet race, one of offshore sailing's most demanding ocean races, in which the rock is the furthest point of the course, and the lighthouse stands as the turnaround marker that the fleet must round before heading back to the finish. The tallest lighthouse in the world today is the Jeddah Light in Saudi Arabia, completed in 1990. It stands 133 meters above sea level, nearly twice the height of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, and was built as a combined lighthouse and residential tower, rather than as a purely functional navigational structure. Its scale is more characteristic of a telecommunications tower than a traditional lighthouse, and it occupies a category slightly apart from the historic towers that preceded it, remarkable for its height, but different in character from the stone and brick structures built in the centuries before it. The lighthouse at Makapu'u Point on the eastern tip of Oahu, Hawaii, was completed in 1909 and houses the largest lighthouse lens in the United States, a hypradient lens with a diameter of 12 feet producing a beam visible 28 miles out to sea, sufficient to mark the eastern approach to the Hawaiian Islands for ships crossing the Pacific. The lens was imported from France, assembled on the headland 400 feet above sea level, and it remains in its original location, still operating, one of the last great Fresnel lenses in active US service. What all of these structures share, across 2 centuries and dozens of countries, is the same underlying requirement. Put a light somewhere that ships can find it and trust it. Everything else, the height, the material, the location, the flash pattern, the specific engineering required to keep it burning through storms and fog and decades of relentless exposure, is a local answer to that universal requirement. The lighthouse at Boston Harbor, and the lighthouse at Fastnet Rock, and the lighthouse at Skerryvore have in common nothing except their purpose. That turns out to be sufficient. There was, for centuries, one category of navigational hazard that not even the most ambitious shore-based lighthouse could address: the danger that lay too far from land for any tower to mark it. For those places, a different kind of lighthouse was required, one that could be moved into position and anchored there, floating over the hazard it was placed to warn sailors about. Some navigational hazards lie far from any coast, anchored in nothing but open water, too deep for any conventional foundation, too far from shore for any lighthouse beam to reach them. For these places, maritime authorities from the 18th century onward developed a floating solution, a vessel designed to stay in one position, carrying a light at its masthead, and eventually a fog signal, moored permanently over the hazard it was positioned to mark. The lightship was, in every functional sense, a lighthouse that had given up its foundations in exchange for the ability to go where no foundation could be laid. A vessel of typically modest size, painted a vivid red or yellow for maximum visibility during the day, its light burning at the top of its mast at night, anchored at its assigned position regardless of weather and unable to leave it for any reason short of emergency. The crew aboard could not choose to move the ship into better shelter when a storm came. They were the light, and the light stayed where it was. The conditions of life aboard a lightship were a compressed version of the isolation that shore lighthouse keepers experienced. Combined with the physical discomfort of being permanently at sea, the ship rolled in swells that passed unnoticed on shore. In moderate weather, the rolling was merely a constant, low-grade disruption to every activity: eating, sleeping, walking between compartments. In heavy weather, it was something considerably worse. The vessel was anchored, which meant it could not run before a storm or seek shelter behind a headland. It stayed at its position and moved with the sea, and the crew stayed with it. Lightship crews worked rotations of typically 20 to 21 days aboard, followed by periods of leave ashore. The shifts were long enough that the enforced proximity of a small crew in a small space, combined with the limited stimulation available at anchor in open water, produced tensions that occasionally became genuine. An account published in the New York Times in 1905, describing life on a Nantucket lightship crew, noted that the men were reduced to near silence with each other by the end of a 20-day rotation, having exhausted every available subject of conversation by the halfway point. Card games and checkers, played in the early days of each shift, became monotonous within a week. The lightship crews who worked the station off Nantucket eventually found a more productive solution to the monotony, weaving rattan baskets over wooden molds in a craft that occupied their hands and their attention across long shifts. The distinctive form these baskets developed, recognizable by its tight weave and wooden base, became so thoroughly associated with the Nantucket Lightship Station that it is still called a Nantucket Lightship basket today, and examples made by contemporary craftspeople sell for several $100s in shops along the Nantucket waterfront. The lightship concept reached its peak in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when dozens of stations were maintained along the coasts of Britain, the United States, and Northern Europe, each one marking a hazard that could not otherwise be adequately signed. The Nantucket South Shoal Lightship marked the outer approaches to New York Harbor, from a position in open Atlantic more than 40 miles from shore. The Goodwin Sands station off the Kent coast of England marked one of the most dangerous stretches of shallow water in the English Channel, a sandbank that had wrecked vessels for centuries. The Sand Key station in the Florida Keys marked the approaches to the Gulf of Mexico from the south. Technology eventually rendered most lightship stations redundant. Improvements in electronic navigation, beginning with radio direction finding in the early 20th century and accelerating through LORAN, satellite navigation, and eventually GPS, gave mariners precise positional information that did not depend on visual reference to a light or audible reference to a fog signal. A hazard that could be accurately charted and transmitted to a ship's navigation system presented far less danger to a vessel with electronic aids than it had to a vessel navigating entirely by eye and dead reckoning. The last lightship in active service in the United States was the Nantucket lightship, which was decommissioned in 1983 and replaced by a large navigational buoy. Most lightship stations around the world followed a similar trajectory across the 1970s and 1980s, as the practical combination of better charts, better electronics, and the lower maintenance cost of unmanned buoys made the staffed floating lighthouse an arrangement that could no longer justify its considerable expense. Several former lightships have been preserved and are maintained as museum vessels at ports around the world. The Chesapeake Lightship at the Baltimore Inner Harbor, the Ambrose Lightship at the South Street Seaport Museum in New York, and the LV-1112 at Harwich in England all allow visitors aboard, providing a tangible sense of the compact, rolling world their crews inhabited across generations of service. The lightship and the lighthouse shared the same purpose and the same fundamental experience: the knowledge that the light burning at your station was keeping someone safe at this exact moment, on a coastline or a hazard somewhere out in the dark. What made a keeper or a lightship crew member good at the job was the same quality in both cases: the ability to take that responsibility seriously every single night, without exception, even the quiet nights when nothing seemed to be at stake. A lighthouse tower is round for the same reason a ship's hull is curved. It offers less resistance to the forces acting on it. A square corner concentrates stress. A round surface distributes it. In open ocean, where waves can strike a tower from any direction and winds can shift unpredictably through the course of a single storm, a cylinder withstands the forces that would gradually loosen and eventually crack a structure with angles and flat faces. The geometry is not aesthetic preference, it is engineering logic. This logic, understood intuitively by the first builders who placed stone towers on exposed rocks, has been the dominant form of lighthouse construction for most of the technology's history. Cylindrical towers of stone, brick, or later concrete stand on headlands and offshore rocks around the world, in a variety of heights and proportions, but in essentially the same fundamental form. The variations in proportion, some towers narrow and tall, others broader and shorter, reflect differences in the structural challenges of each site. A tower on a solid granite headland can be taller and more slender than a tower on a sandy or unstable base, which needs a broader foundation to resist both settlement and the lateral forces of wind and wave. Stripe patterns and other paint schemes serve a navigational function during daylight hours, equivalent to the flash characteristic at night. This painted pattern is called a daymark, and it identifies a lighthouse visually to a sailor who is looking for a specific tower along a stretch of coast where several lighthouses might be visible simultaneously. The Hatteras Lighthouse distinctive black and white spiral stripe, the red and white horizontal bands of certain New England lights, and the bold geometric patterns painted on towers in the Canadian maritime provinces are not decorative choices. They are identification codes in a visual language agreed upon by maritime authorities and published in sailing directions, just like the nighttime flash patterns. The lantern room at the top of a lighthouse tower has its own specific architecture, distinct from the tower itself and serving a precise set of requirements. The glass used in lighthouse lantern rooms was traditionally plate glass of unusually high optical quality, minimizing the distortion of the beam as it passed through the surrounding walls. The frames holding the glass panels were angled specifically to reduce reflections that might create false lights or interfere with the beam's reach. An astragal, the narrow metal bar dividing one pane from the next, was designed to be as thin as possible while maintaining structural strength to minimize the interruption of the beam as the rotating lens passed it. Every element of a lantern room was a compromise between the physical requirements of keeping water and wind out and the optical requirements of letting light through with minimum interference. The keeper's dwelling, whether built onto the base of the tower or as a separate house within the station compound, represents a different set of requirements. Lighthouse dwellings on shore stations were often substantial, built to house a family through long periods of limited contact with the outside world, and designed to withstand the same weather that the tower above them faced. At the most exposed stations, walls were thick stone, windows were small and set deep into the walls, and the orientation of the house relative to the prevailing wind was a significant architectural consideration. Rock lighthouse stations, where space was too limited for a separate dwelling, incorporated the keeper's quarters directly into the tower structure, stacking functional spaces vertically in a sequence that typically placed the machinery and oil storage at the base, working and living spaces in the middle, and the watchroom and lantern room at the top. The staircase connecting all these levels was almost universally spiral. A spiral stair occupies the least floor area for the height it covers, leaving the maximum usable space in each circular floor plan. The specific rise and tread dimensions of lighthouse stairs were often standardized, allowing equipment to be carried up without modification to the tools and techniques used at other stations. The repetitive motion of climbing a lighthouse staircase, the same slight adjustment of balance for each step, the same measured rhythm of feet on stone or iron, is one of the experiences that visitors to working historic lighthouse towers consistently describe as unexpectedly meditative. The overall visual impression of a lighthouse, the white or striped tower against a dramatic sky, the keeper's house at its base, the lantern room at the summit, is so thoroughly embedded in the visual language of coastlines that it functions as a symbol independent of the practical engineering that produced it. People who have never been to a coast know what a lighthouse looks like. People who have never needed one can describe it. The form communicates something beyond its function, something about edge and purpose, and the value of a light in the dark that the engineering alone does not fully explain. The engineers who built these towers were solving navigational problems. The form those solutions took, over 2 centuries of working and reworking the same basic challenge in different locations and different materials, produced something that looks, in hindsight, as though it could not have been designed any other way. The automation of lighthouses did not happen suddenly. It arrived in stages, one technology at a time, over the course of roughly a century, and at each stage, it reduced by some measurable degree the human presence that had been at the center of lighthouse operation since the first keeper was placed at the first station. Electrification came first, beginning in the late 19th century at the larger and more accessible stations, where connecting to a power supply was practical. An electric lamp burns without a wick to trim, without an oil reservoir to refill, without the gradual accumulation of smoke residue on the lens that oil combustion produces. The first duty of the day for keepers at electric stations changed in character, shifting from an urgently practical task to something closer to inspection and cleaning, rather than the hands-on fuel and wick management that had defined the role. The keeper was still required. The work was different. Automatic lamp changers appeared in the early 20th century, devices that could rotate a fresh bulb into position when the operating bulb burned out. without any human intervention. Remote monitoring systems, developed from telecommunications technology, allowed supervisory staff to observe the operational status of a lighthouse from a distance, receiving signals that confirmed the light was burning and the mechanism was running as prescribed. Each of these developments pushed back the practical necessity of having a person physically present at the station, not all the way, but a little further each time. The systematic automation of national lighthouse fleets began in earnest in the second half of the 20th century, driven by a combination of improving technology and the simple economics of maintaining a large professional workforce at hundreds of stations, many of them in remote and expensive-to-supply locations. Britain began a formal program of lighthouse automation in the late 1960s. Station after station was assessed, its systems updated or replaced, and its keeper withdrawn. The last lighthouse in England to retain a resident keeper was the South Foreland Lighthouse in Kent, which was automated in 1998. Scotland's final staffed lighthouse, North Ronaldsay, on the most northerly of the Orkney Islands, was automated in the same year. The last keeper formally employed by the Northern Lighthouse Board departed at the end of March 1998, ending a Scottish lighthouse keeping tradition that had run continuously since the late 18th century. In the United States, the transition was somewhat less coordinated, occurring at individual stations as the practical case for automation became clear at each location. The last keeper of a traditional lighthouse within the Coast Guard's staffing program left his post in 1990, with the decommissioning of the keeper role at the final stations that had maintained one into the late 20th century. France maintained a small number of staffed stations into the 21st century, primarily at the most isolated offshore locations where the logistical complexity of fully automated systems and the cost of emergency response if something went wrong made a human presence genuinely worthwhile. As of the 2010s, approximately a dozen French lighthouses remained staffed, maintained partly as training facilities for maritime safety personnel, and partly because their remote locations made reliable automation difficult to guarantee. The keepers who held the role at the end of the staffed lighthouse era carried an accumulated understanding of their specific stations, their particular weather patterns, the precise quirks of their equipment, and their coastline that could not be transferred to a maintenance log or a technical manual. Several of those who left in the final years of automation spoke about the departure in terms that had nothing to do with the job as a profession, and everything to do with the relationship they had formed with a specific place over years and decades of living in it, watching it in every kind of weather, and being responsible for its light every night without exception. One keeper at an Irish lighthouse, interviewed shortly before his station was automated in the 1990s, described his relationship to the light itself in terms that were entirely practical in content, but carried something more in the delivery. He said the light had never gone out on his watch, not once in 23 years, and that he had no way to know whether the automated system that replaced him would maintain that record, because he would not be there to see it. He was not sentimental about the job. He simply could not find a way to feel indifferent about whether the light stayed on. The lights stayed on. The automated systems that replaced the keepers are, by most measures, more reliable in mechanical terms than the humans who preceded them, less vulnerable to human error, illness, exhaustion, or distraction. The coastlines they serve are navigated safely by millions of voyages each year, guided by lights, tended by no one, and requiring no one's consistent attention. The keeper's cottage stands empty at the station. The equipment runs on its timer. The light turns, exactly as specified, exactly on schedule. It is, in every practical sense, working perfectly. The logbooks that lighthouse keepers were required to maintain for their official duties were records of the station. But keepers also wrote letters, kept private journals, and in some cases produced memoirs. And these less official documents reveal a dimension of lighthouse life that the carefully maintained station logs with their standardized entries and bureaucratic form, were never designed to contain. The official logbook entry for a storm reads something like this: Gale from the southwest, wind force 9, seas running to 30 feet, light burning throughout, no vessels reported in distress. What the same keeper might write in a letter to their family reads differently. The storm last night was the worst I have seen in 15 years here. The tower shook in a way I have never felt before, a vibration in the stone itself, and I spent 4 hours certain that the lantern room glass would fail. It did not. By morning the sea had dropped to something manageable, and I found that I had not eaten or sat down since the afternoon before. Both statements describe the same night. One is the record of what the station did. The other is the record of what the person inside the station experienced. The two things are not the same, and the difference between them is where much of the actual human history of lighthouse keeping lives. Keeper memoirs and letters from the 19th and early 20th centuries survive in archives in Britain, Ireland, the United States, Canada, and Australia, and they share certain recurring qualities. The keepers who wrote for their own purposes wrote with an attentiveness to small things that is characteristic of people who spend extended time in a single, relatively simple environment. They noticed the quality of light on the water at specific times of day, the particular behavior of birds in different wind conditions, the way the fog settled at different temperatures. They wrote about the passing ships with a kind of personal interest, noting familiar vessels by name and commenting when one they knew failed to appear on schedule. They also wrote with a directness about the emotional texture of the work that the logbooks required them to suppress. A keeper at a Scottish rock lighthouse who had been on the rock for 6 weeks without a visit from the relief tender wrote, "The silence here is not the same as silence anywhere else. It is the silence of being very specifically removed from the world, rather than merely being in a quiet part of it. I find myself grateful for the sound of the machinery, and less grateful on the days when I am not." Hunduit. This observation is precise enough to be useful to anyone who has tried to understand what extended offshore isolation actually feels like from the inside. The humor in keeper correspondence is also genuine and occasionally notable. A lighthouse inspector's report from an American station in the 1880s noted, with evident mild exasperation, that the keeper had submitted a requisition for an unusual quantity of lamp black, considerably more than the standard consumption for a station of that classification. Investigation revealed that the keeper had been using it to produce a quite competent series of portraits of passing ships, which he had been mailing to their home ports as a gift to their owners. The inspector's report recorded the requisition as unauthorized, but noted the artistic quality of the work approvingly. Keepers corresponded with each other at neighboring stations, exchanging observations about weather and shipping and the condition of their equipment, creating a network of informal communication that served both practical and social purposes. A keeper who noticed something unusual in the passage of ships along a particular route might write to the keeper at the next station to ask whether they had observed the same thing. A keeper whose fog signal equipment was behaving unusually might describe the symptoms to a colleague at a similar station and receive, in return, a practical suggestion that their shared official channel would never have delivered as quickly. The letters also contain grief. Keepers who had lost a colleague to the sea. Keepers writing to families of those who had drowned at their stations. Keepers facing the final years of their service, with the knowledge that automation was coming, and the life they had organized themselves around for 30 or 40 years was ending. A keeper in County Donegal, writing in the early 1990s as Irish lighthouse automation proceeded, described the feeling of knowing that his light would continue after he was gone, not as a comfort, but as something more complicated. The light is what I have been. When it no longer needs me, I will have to find out what I am instead. I do not know yet what that is. The logbooks are the official record. The letters and journals and memoirs are where the keepers themselves are. writing as clearly and honestly as they could about the particular life they had chosen or been given or inherited, out on the edge of the water, keeping the light. The logbooks that lighthouse keepers were required to maintain for their official duties were records of the station. But keepers also wrote letters, kept private journals, and in some cases produced memoirs. And these less official documents reveal a dimension of lighthouse life that the carefully maintained station logs, with their standardized entries and bureaucratic form, were never designed to contain. The official logbook entry for a storm reads something like this: Gale from the southwest, wind force 9, seas running to 30 feet, light burning throughout, no vessels reported in distress. What the same keeper might write in a letter to their family reads differently. The storm last night was the worst I have seen in 15 years here. The tower shook in a way I have never felt before, a vibration in the stone itself, and I spent 4 hours certain that the lantern room glass would fail. It did not. By morning the sea had dropped to something manageable, and I found that I had not eaten or sat down since the afternoon before. Both statements describe the same night. One is the record of what the station did. The other is the record of what the person inside the station experienced. The two things are not the same, and the difference between them is where much of the actual human history of lighthouse keeping lives. Keeper memoirs and letters from the 19th and early 20th centuries survive in archives in Britain, Ireland, the United States, Canada, and Australia, and they share certain recurring qualities. The keepers who wrote for their own purposes wrote with an attentiveness to small things that is characteristic of people who spend extended time in a single, relatively simple environment. They noticed the quality of light on the water at specific times of day, the particular behavior of birds in different wind conditions, the way the fog settled at different temperatures. They wrote about the passing ships with a kind of personal interest, noting familiar vessels by name and commenting when one they knew failed to appear on schedule. They also wrote with a directness about the emotional texture of the work that the logbooks required them to suppress. A keeper at a Scottish rock lighthouse who had been on the rock for 6 weeks without a visit from the relief tender wrote, "The silence here is not the same as silence anywhere else. It is the silence of being very specifically removed from the world, rather than merely being in a quiet part of it. I find myself grateful for the sound of the machinery, and less grateful on the days when I am not." This observation is precise enough to be useful to anyone who has tried to understand what extended offshore isolation actually feels like from the inside. The humor in keeper correspondence is also genuine and occasionally notable. A lighthouse inspector's report from an American station in the 1880s noted, with evident mild exasperation, that the keeper had submitted a requisition for an unusual quantity of lamp black, considerably more than the standard consumption for a station of that classification. Investigation revealed that the keeper had been using it to produce a quite competent series of portraits of passing ships, which he had been mailing to their home ports as a gift to their owners. The inspector's report recorded the requisition as unauthorized, but noted the artistic quality of the work approvingly. Keepers corresponded with each other at neighboring stations, exchanging observations about weather and shipping and the condition of their equipment, creating a network of informal communication that served both practical and social purposes. A keeper who noticed something unusual in the passage of ships along a particular route might write to the keeper at the next station to ask whether they had observed the same thing. A keeper whose fog signal equipment was behaving unusually might describe the symptoms to a colleague at a similar station and receive, in return, a practical suggestion that their shared official channel would never have delivered as quickly. The letters also contain grief. Keepers who had lost a colleague to the sea, keepers writing to families of those who had drowned at their stations, keepers facing the final years of their service with the knowledge that automation was coming and the life they had organized themselves around for 30 or 40 years was ending. A keeper in County Donegal, writing in the early 1990s as Irish lighthouse automation proceeded, described the feeling of knowing that his light would continue after he was gone, not as a comfort, but as something more complicated. The light is what I have been. When it no longer needs me, I will have to find out what I am instead. I do not know yet what that is. The logbooks are the official record. The letters and journals and memoirs are where the keepers themselves are, writing as clearly and honestly as they could about the particular life they had chosen or been given or inherited, out on the edge of the water, keeping the light. When a lighthouse is decommissioned or automated, the question of what happens to it is not always simple. A lighthouse is not just a navigational instrument. It is often the oldest surviving building on a stretch of coastline, sometimes the only structure of any kind within miles, and it has typically been maintained with unusual care for its entire life, because the alternative to maintaining it was always a ship in the rocks. These buildings are in better condition than almost anything else of comparable age, and the people who have lived and worked near them across generations have developed relationships with them that do not end when the light is automated and the keeper goes home. The United States Congress passed the National Historic Lighthouse Preservation Act in 2000, establishing a formal process for transferring lighthouse properties out of federal ownership to organizations capable of maintaining and preserving them. Under this program, lighthouse towers, keepers' cottages, and associated buildings at stations no longer required for active navigation were offered first to federal agencies, then to state and local governments, then to non-profit preservation organizations, and finally to private individuals. The program has resulted in the transfer of more than 100 lighthouse properties since its enactment, with recipients including historical societies, maritime museums, local preservation trusts, and private owners who have committed to maintaining the buildings and, in many cases, opening them to the public. Many former keepers' dwellings have been converted to accommodation, allowing visitors to stay overnight in the buildings where lighthouse families once lived. The experience of spending a night in a lighthouse keeper's cottage, on a headland with the automated light still turning above, is described by those who have done it in terms that consistently emphasize quietness, the absence of traffic, the sound of the sea, the particular quality of the dark when there is no other artificial light visible except the lighthouse beam passing overhead at its prescribed interval. People who live in cities and experience this for the first time often report that they had not understood, before this specific experience, what silence actually sounded like. The historic Fresnel lenses that stood in major lighthouse towers for more than a century have required their own preservation program. The combination of automated operation, reduced maintenance budgets, and occasional vandalism at unmanned stations made leaving large, irreplaceable Fresnel lenses in unattended towers increasingly risky across the second half of the 20th century. Many first and second order lenses were carefully removed from their towers and transferred to maritime museums, where they could be properly housed, lit, and displayed for the public. The experience of standing beside an illuminated first-order Fresnel lens in a museum is one that people consistently describe in terms of surprise, at the scale and at the movement. A first-order lens stands roughly 2.5 meters tall, has a diameter of approximately 1.5 meters, and consists of hundreds of individually ground glass prisms arranged in their precise concentric pattern. When lit and set in rotation, as many museum examples are, it turns with the same unhurried, almost effortless motion it would have shown in its lighthouse tower, the beam sweeping around the room at its prescribed speed, each pass of the light across a visitor's face carrying the same quality that sailors 2 miles offshore would have experienced when the beam found them from across dark water. Volunteer lighthouse caretakers and preservation societies operate at working historic lighthouses around the world, maintaining buildings that maritime authorities no longer staff but have not yet transferred to permanent private stewardship. These volunteers serve in rotations, living at the station for periods ranging from a few days to several weeks, performing basic maintenance, greeting visitors, and maintaining the historical record of the station. Organizations, including the United States Lighthouse Society and its equivalents in Britain, Ireland, Canada, and Australia, coordinate these programs and provide training and support for volunteers who want to spend time in a lighthouse and contribute to its preservation. For some of these volunteers, the motivation is straightforwardly historical: an interest in maritime history, a family connection to a specific lighthouse, or the keeping tradition generally, or a desire to understand at first hand what a life at a lighthouse station actually involved. For others, the motivation is harder to articulate, but seems to have something to do with the particular quality of a lighthouse station as a place to be. The edge of the land, the unobstructed view in every direction, the purpose of the structure and the simplicity of that purpose, the sound of the sea that is not a background but a presence. Whatever draws people to these places, the result is that the lighthouses are maintained, visited, and known to each new generation, not only as historical artifacts, but as places that can still be experienced directly. The logbooks are in archives, the Fresnel lenses are in museums. The keeper's cottage is available to book for a weekend in September. The light above it is still turning, on its timer, on schedule. The story of what lighthouses have meant is still being written, and it is still being written by the people who go to them and find something there that they were not entirely expecting. There is a light turning right now, on a headland somewhere close to where you are, or somewhere very far away, and it has been turning, in one form or another, for longer than almost any other human institution, still in continuous operation. It started on a small limestone island at the entrance to an Egyptian harbour, where a man named Sostratus of Cnidus built a tower over 100 meters tall and placed a furnace at the top, its bronze mirror directing the light toward the sea. The word for that tower passed into Greek, into French, into Spanish, into Italian, into Portuguese, and into a dozen other languages, where it still means exactly what it meant the night that fire was first lit in Alexandria, around 280 BCE. A light, a tower, something to find in the dark. It continued through the Tower of Hercules on a wind-swept Atlantic headland in Spain, built while Rome still governed its empire, and still operational 2,000 years later, guiding container ships into the same harbour it guided Roman trading vessels toward, when the city beside it was called Brigantium. It moved through the first fog bells and the first steam horns and the first electric foghorns, through every variation of noise that human ingenuity produced to say, when the light cannot be seen, I am here, the station is here, you are not alone on this coastline. Augustin Fresnel worked through his tuberculosis for 8 years to build a lens that bent light with such precision that a modest oil lamp could be visible 20 miles away, and his demonstration of it across Paris in April 1821 made the members of the Lighthouse Commission, in his own words, dazzled. He died in 1827 at 39 years old, before a single lighthouse he had improved sent its beam across the water. The Cordovan Lighthouse lit his lens on July 25, 1823, and it has been lighting variants of his design at lighthouses around the world every night since then, for 200 years and counting. Robert Stevenson sent his workers onto the Bell Rock during the few hours each tide allowed, building a tower on a reef that the North Sea covered for 22 hours out of every 24, and those workers eventually internalized the tide's schedule so completely that they woke before their alarms, their bodies adjusted to a rhythm set by the sea rather than any clock. That tower, first lit in 1811, is still standing, still active, the oldest sea-washed lighthouse in the world. Ida Lewis rowed out into Newport Harbor 54 times over a career that began when she was 15 and continued until her death at 68. And the 18 people she pulled from the water are the cleanest accounting available of what a lighthouse keeper at a good station could mean for the immediate physical survival of people living near the sea. Grace Darling rode into a North Sea storm at 4 in the morning with her father and brought 9 survivors back from the wreck of the Forfarshire. And the fame that followed her for the 4 years until she died was a measure of how much the public recognized in that act, something they could not quite do themselves. The keepers who filled the logbooks with their daily observations of weather and ships and migrating birds left behind an archive that scientists still consult. The meteor shower over Cape Lookout in 1833, described in a keeper's handwriting on a page in a record book that was never intended to preserve anything more remarkable than the oil level and the wind direction. The foghorn at the Flannan Isles on the night of December 15, 1900, sounded over a lighthouse where no one remained to tend it. The 3 keepers gone, without explanation, into whatever the North Atlantic had taken them to. The mystery, as complete today as it was when the relief tender arrived and found the light dark and the station empty. The last keepers locked the doors at their stations, and the automated systems took over, and the lights stayed on exactly as they were supposed to, and the coastlines remained as safe as they had been when human hands were trimming the wicks each morning. The Fresnel lenses that were too large and too fragile to leave in unattended towers were carried carefully to maritime museums, where they still turn in their glass cases, their hundreds of ground prisms bending whatever light falls on them, with the same precision that Fresnel designed into them 2 centuries ago. The keeper's cottage at a dozen former stations is available for a night's stay, and the light above it turns on its timer, and the sea is audible through the walls, and the quality of the darkness, when there is no other artificial light visible except that one slow beam overhead, is the same quality of darkness that every keeper who ever stood a night watch at this station experienced across every year of that station's operation. If this long journey through the history and science and human lives of lighthouses has carried you somewhere quiet enough to rest, that is precisely what it was built to do. There are more stories here, more coastlines, and more keepers, and more lenses, and more logbooks, and this channel will be here on whatever night you need somewhere calm to settle into. Come back whenever the dark water outside seems worth understanding a little more fully. The light is still turning. It will be turning when you wake up. It does not need anyone to watch it, and it does not stop.